Welcome back to another episode of Stack Racks TV, Stack Rack Boxing, where we talk boxing, but, we do talk cash from time to time. It is what it is, you know what I'm saying? A lot of people sleeping on old Shockey Foster in this fight, right? I seen a lot of people bringing up that title fight that Raymond had. He came back and, got that dub. And I think people are underestimating, how much experience play a factor in these type of fights, right? Shockey Foster, a guy that has experienced the highs, lows of the sport. He's what I like to call seasoned, right? And I'm in the South. I'm from the South. We like our food seasoned, right? So being seasoned is a good thing, right? Like, down here, if you ain't sneezing, it ain't season. You catch my drill. See what I'm saying? So for me, I think people are underestimating how much work this guy has actually put in to get where he at. Raymond has put a lot of work in too. But Raymond has, had eyes on him prior to him becoming a professional. Same thing with Shockey Foster, but two different routes, right? You got a guy who is more the street route for real, and you might got a guy that may have dibbled and dabbled, but he don't got no scars from it. You know what I'm saying? And I like that about Foster because it showed me that he got grit. He's a guy that'll get knocked down and go back to the drawing board, right? A lot of guys that get knocked down, like Raymond did when he fought against Nick Ball, and they don't go back to the drawing board. They chalk it up to the game, right? And I think all of those are factors that are important in this fight. Right now, if we look at both of these guys, who needs the win more? I think both of these guys need to win, right? Raymond coming off that performance against Nick Ball, he was selling it, as a weight issue. Now he's moved up in weight, he feels better, so there's not any excuses there, right? We got Shockey Foster, he needs to win this fight to push him up, right? To redeem himself from going up, down, up, down, up, down. And I think that he knows that this time climbing back up, that, it can't be nothing that separates him from success. And this is why I want it for Foster, right? And I'm gonna be honest, because I would have Shakur beating Foster, but I want it for Foster because, that's kind of my story in my life, getting knocked down, getting back up, getting knocked down, getting back up. And usually those type of guys, when they get that opportunity, they keep it, and that's the only, it's like, Shockey Foster, talented, skillful, got all the skills in the world, right? But he has not had a chance to become mainstream, right? We talking about a guy who's been pro for a while. He's been a belt holder for a while. He's been a guy who's been around the sport for a while. And to now be starting to get kind of some of that recognition that these guys get just tagging along, I feel like he's not satisfied with that. And when fighters that got grit and determination, they're not satisfied, they continue to go back to that drawing board and go back to work. And I feel like right now Foster is coming into this fight with all the momentum, right? He's been more active. His quality of opponents has been well. We seen how he came off of a layoff. We seen how he handled a guy who was very experienced. So, for me, it's one of them things where, him coming into this fight, he can make it as easy as he wants to, or he can make it as hard as he wants to. Him going into this fight and making it easy, boxing. Use that long reach, not too much movement in there. We already know he's the more favored fighter going into this fight, considering who he's tied to, right? So if Shock can go in this fight and look for the opportunities that make sense for his skill advantage, it's gonna be an easy night. I see Raymond getting frustrated. I see him getting tired, and I just don't see him being able to edge Shaq you know, not just because of the experience, you know, not just because of the activity, you know. I like to say on this channel, right, sometimes personalities win fights, you know. The guy who's more stoic, you know, with experience, you know, he's usually gonna beat the guy that's more outspoken with less experience. We've seen that in the sport time and time again, right? And for Raymond Ford, this is a chance to be the active vet, you know, a young vet, a vet that's not, you know, over the hill, headed out. So for Raymond Ford to get this W, you know, it'll put him in a position, you know, that only he could imagine being in, right? You know, especially if he was to win this fight in dominating fashion, which I can only see him winning this fight in a dominating fashion. You know, Raymond Ford, arms too short. He's a little on the smaller side. He can box, yes, but you know, I like to see him more when he's pushing the pace and being active. He's not a guy I like to see on the back foot, you know, just because he doesn't have the length, no diddy, you know, to keep a guy back, right? We seen that with the Nick Ball fight. Now, you would have add a couple more inches on his height in that fight, you know, a couple more inches on that reach. With his skill set, it would have been different, you know, but unfortunately, we don't get to pick our body sizes, right? So I think that's going to be what makes this fight, you know, lopsided. You know, just his natural giving abilities. You know, Foster being tall, long, fast, rangy. You know, he's getting in there with guys who are the faster fighter. But, you know, when he's going in there, he's making them look real slow. He's making them look real average. He's beating them to the punch. And he's willing to stay in the pocket. You know what I'm saying? So he's willing to give you what you want. You want him to toe-to-toe. You want him to stand in the pocket. You want him to fight on the back foot. You know, Shock right now is operating on all cylinders right now. And like I said, it's going to be hard to knock this guy off his game. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like a dude in a dice game. 4-5-6, 4-5 on the Chappelle show. He said, this guy the goddamn devil. See what I'm saying? He on a roll right now. You know what I'm saying? And the longer that these guys continue to let him get in his groove and continue to get better, it's going, you know, like I always say, you know, once you get used to those lights, everything going to be all right. You know, so say, for example, he beat Ford in this fight. And, you know, they still playing the games like they do with, you know, people who go up and in there, right? And they don't want to give him an opportunity, right? And they want to keep giving him step-ups until he loses and never gets the opportunity, right? That's a scam with it, right? All he's going to do is boost his profile. You know, what you go give him another fight, a Navarrete, you go boost his profile even more. So it's like, for Shock right now, all he got to do is go in there, win, look good, you know, and everything gonna fall into place. You know what I'm saying? And I'm so happy for that guy because, you know, all those things that could have deterred him from the sport, you know, and he continued to keep going. You know what I'm saying? Shout out to Raymond Ford. Shout out to O'Shaquie Foster. You know, Raymond Ford got a lot of work ahead of him on fight night. You know, Shock got a lot of work ahead of him on fight night. But I hope both of these guys come out safe, you know, and they're able to take care of their family, because that's what makes the most sense at the end of the day.